couple of things. So checking preferred gender pronouns. Who's speaking first in opening government?
Terry speaking first, he or they.
Alright. And DTM.
Magreta, she.
Closing off. Who's speaking first?
Jason first, he.
Mikey speaking second, she.
Alright, thanks. Leader of who's leader of opposition?
Who is he or they, please?
Alright. Leah Oath.
Gigi, she please.
Closing off. Who's speaking first?
Flora speaking first, your day.
Emma speaking second, she or they is fine.
And also on second thing, so do you guys consent to filming or not filming at all? Everyone cool?
Yeah.
Good?
Yep.
Alright, cool. Right. Welcome to ESL semifinals and congratulations to all the teams that make this far. Opening government, we have Indonesia A. Opening opposition, Leiden A.
Shadow.
Closing government, De La Salle U A. Closing opposition, Leiden B. On the motion, these helps leave the West should prioritize stability over exporting democracy in foreign policy. Let's welcome Prime Minister to start motion.
Here, here.
Test. Ladies and gentlemen, several models for today's debate. Number one, what do we mean by stability? Stability that we envision in opening government is the absence of war that currently ongoing in Middle East states. We don't like to see sectarian conflict sponsored by the proxy war contributed by the existence of United States soldiers. We also don't like to see the conflicts between government and terrorist organizations. We also think that the definition of stability is the ability of investors and the ability of society to do to access their basic necessities by engaging in basic economic activities, in which that most likely, if stability exists, investors would like to come because there's no prediction of conflict and there's no barriers for this particular investor to gain profit in that particular area. Second model, what do we mean by democracy? Do we mean exporting democracy? We don't agree that Western states would like to toppling down authoritarian regime in Middle East countries. We also don't like them to sponsor opposition party in Middle East countries. We also don't like them to sponsor society, for example, to do strikes like what happened in Egypt. We can see that the consequences that will happen in opening government is that we will allow authoritarian government to exist. And we are okay with that. We think that throughout the history, United States government has been able to strike a deal, the things that they would like to compromise with authoritarian regime and the things that we don't want to compromise. For example, throughout the history, we are able to say to authoritarian regime to still allow aids to go to minority groups and to allow aids to go to individuals in that particular state. We think that authoritarian regime is better rather than exporting democracy that will result in further stability and inability of individuals to access their basic rights. The goal and the world that we envision in opening government is a better world in which that there will be absence of war and the ability of society to access their basic rights. In my first argument, I'm going to explain to you why oftentimes the way that Western countries exporting democracy will result in a systematic problem of instability, sectarian war, etc., etc. So let's just start. Number one, what are the systematic problem of democracy? Oftentimes, ladies and gentlemen, the Western states decide in exporting democracy, particularly in toppling down authoritarian regime by conducting war. Most likely, ladies and gentlemen, this war will result in a state stalemate in which that there will be a long-term war in which that neither the West or neither the authoritarian regime would like to give up in this particular war. We think that this condition of stalemate oftentimes result in further stability and inability of people to access their basic rights in the current status quo. So we think that because the West would like to suddenly impose democracy in this particular area, most likely the war is not the war that is calculated by the politician to be win, but calculated by the politicians to just go there and fight, topple down the authoritarian regime without seeing the ability to win the unwinnable war. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, oftentimes when we export democracy, the way that we restructure the government, assuming that the intervention is successful, we apply favoritism policies. This happened in sectarian divide policies that the United States imposed in Iraqi government, in which that the United States highly favor for Shia to be able to be represented in the government institution and also in the military personnel. This result in Sunni community in Iraq to feel excluded and search for other form of protection, coming for example in forming terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and also ISIS. We say this is inevitable coming from United States government, because you will always need to take stance when you intervening in these particular countries, and oftentimes you will take stance to the opposition party that exists in that particular state. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the systematic problem that also occur when we are exporting democracies, this create a premature condition in which that the society who, for example, in the first place tried to impose the democracy in their country and doing strikes, second guessing whether or not democracy is the right thing to do. Because what you see in Egypt, for example, when they go strikes, it results in a more retaliation coming from the government, and it results in more killing of civilians in the current status quo, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that there's a systematic tendencies of problems that the Western states are currently been doing in the current status quo. POI.
So, will civil Sunnis more represented at the point where you appoint a Shia dictator within their country?
Yes. Why? Because society will be able to gain more trust if they are the one who initiated the change in that particular area, ladies and gentlemen. But here's the thing, we think that authoritarian regime is pragmatic, ladies and gentlemen. They also hate instability and conflict, because that's the only way for them to be prosper and also to maintain their power. And we think that this is comparatively a better condition for people in this particular area to be able to access themselves, to be able to access the basic rights by going to companies. But ladies and gentlemen, here's the most important thing. We think that the trend of Western democracy's foreign policy is always a trade-off. Here's the thing, when we decided to fight Bashar al-Assad in Syria, we are sacrificing our political capital and our military capital to not fight ISIS to begin with. And here's the important thing, ladies and gentlemen, when we are fighting Bashar al-Assad on the ground, we don't have a common enemy in which that we have a collective identity to fight a common enemy as ISIS. And in opening government, we think that ISIS is a more imminent threat compared to authoritarian regime that currently exists in Middle East, because ISIS as an extremist organization will most likely conduct a direct attack to United States compared to this authoritarian regime who would like only to maintain their power. And here's the important thing, ladies and gentlemen. When you are fighting Bashar al-Assad as well as you are fighting ISIS, most likely the way that you are fighting Bashar al-Assad will result in more stability on the ground. That makes individual that create lawlessness, that makes individual would like to join themselves to terrorist organization. We think that in the opening government there is a systematic problem regarding the way that we export our democracies and the way that it's a trade-off right now to be able for us to prioritize the most imminent threat that the United States face. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now let's welcome leader of opposition whose preferred gender pronoun is he or they.
Yes? Dear panel, in opening opposition we believe that the only way to true sustainability is to have a formal state to which everyone can buy in and to which everyone can relate. We also think that the only form of such a state has to be democracy. That's what we're going to argue to do. Two things. Firstly, why dictatorships inherently become incredibly evil or will eventually fall, and why that's far more harmful than the comparative. B, minorities where you can't just sacrifice them, why that's harmful in terms of long-term policy. Firstly, shortly, what do we support? So, we think this mostly takes place in most post-conflict societies, given the fact that the West has like most sort of influence there. What would we like to do there? We're going to stay there for a relatively long time. We're going to provide, that means, a constitution with some form of basic rights, which guarantees some sort of democracy. Eventually, there will be elections. At the moment, political parties could have been formed. At the moment, at some reasonable point, we're more than happy to, like, militarily accompany these elections to make sure they will be fine. Those are the kinds of things we are directly supporting, right? To the extent that this is countries we are not necessarily intervening, we are more than happy to fund pro-democracy groups. We are more than happy to prevent soft pressure on many governments to eventually step down to be replaced by democracy. Question on our counter-model thing?
Just a question.
Yeah, sure.
Right. In the instance that that country rejects the idea of a democracy, do you think that the West, or under your model, will the West enforce it?
So, this is the point, like, it's not this thing as a country likes something, right? There are certain people within that country that like it. It's probably going to be dictatorship, and there are many people in the country who are not going to like it. So I think it's a really weird POI. At the moment, like, all 100% of people are shouting, no, we don't want the democracy. Yeah, then we're obviously not going to do it. We don't think that's like any relevant part of this debate. In the vast majority, to many people, it will be way better. 3 points of rebuttal that don't fit in. Firstly, we get this notion that the dictator can compromise, right? So that means we can give aid to certain groups. Firstly, know that then you're directly dependent on, like, a dictator willing to help a group he's currently oppressing, right? What's the impact of this? Firstly, it's not that effective. Secondly, that you're only helping the people who are not technically worse off, right? Given the fact that if they would have been worse off, then would oppress far more significantly, and aid wouldn't be allowed, right? The other thing is that the best thing you can get in is food packets. That's in no way sustainable help for these people. That means you keep them alive at best, but don't help these minorities in a fundamental way. We think that's incredibly problematic. Then we get this idea, inherently this will lead to a stalemate at the moment you intervene. No, we don't think that's true, right? We think you just should intervene more and probably make sure you can get rid of this conflict and you can win the civil war, right? We think in many cases we did it badly, for example pulling out way too early or not going far enough in. We do think in this specific... And we think in this specific case, it's significantly easier to get rid of at the moment you actually do is, that means all the harms don't stand. It's in no way inherent to supporting democracy. Thirdly, they told you we're inherently going to oppress a group at the moment you have democracy. Yeah, the whole point is the comparative, right? On the our side of you have democracy, it means people can vote, have some sort of buy-in, and that the basic rights are being guaranteed. On the that side of the house, you're going to have a dictator which can do whatever it wants, right? We think that's incredibly problematic on the that side of the house. Rest of your rebuttal will be interwoven. Firstly, why dictatorships inherently get incredibly evil or will fall. So the funny thing about a dictatorship is that there's a very limited amount of people with limited support, right? First, you know that dictatorships are fundamentally unaccountable to the people. I think that's incredibly harmful in and of itself. Look, for example, at the many dictators with literally like billions of dollars, while many of the countries are starving of poverty, right? That's a very significant harm that they have to deal with. But I think there are all the more prominent issues. The only way to get rid of a democracy, like of a dictatorship, and to get regime change is through violence, right? Dictatorship know this. That means that the main thing they're going to do, and the main incentive, given the fact that they want to remain in power, is to crack down on all violence before it even started, right? Two ways they're doing to do so. Firstly, massively limiting civil liberties, right? For example, cracking down on freedom of expression, cracking down on the freedom of gathering, simply to make sure this is not going to happen. I think this has many harms to the people and people don't like it. The second thing they're going to do is fear, right? Fear is the most effective mechanism that people are not going to crack down. It means any kind of oppression, people simply walk on the street, and we saw this in many countries like China, Hong Kong, etc., are directly cracked down upon in an incredibly violent way. What's the point of this? People don't like it. I mean, people as a whole become more opposed to the government in general. Why is that problematic? It makes them more likely to radicalize. It means the government is going to be feared even more. They're going to do the only thing they know to do, which is crack down on them even harder and implement their civil liberties even harder. That means this advantages even more people who don't like the new way of life, which leads to a self-perpetuating cycle which gets more and more oppressive. This is what we saw in North Korea, that's what we saw in Iraq, that's what we saw in Syria, right? I think that's incredibly problematic because it's inherently oppressive. Two other mechanisms to which this happen. Firstly, internal selections through dictatorships, right? No, that you want as few incidents as possible. It means the people you're going to recruit for your government are people who are in the sub-regime, who are in their part of the government, got the less kind of incidents as possible. The way to which they did that is oppression as hard as possible. It means that everyone within their regime came to power by being as oppressive as possible. They're probably going to remain that way given the fact that that's how they got selected and that's how they got used to. That means you have a far more oppressive government. Lastly, you need an army in order to violently oppress people, right? That means the most important people within such such a country are often the leaders of the army. They have a direct incentive by a violent government because that makes them even more powerful. It means very influential people have a direct incentive to become more violent. We think that's horrible. It means you get very, very oppressive regimes, which make people very unhappy. The alternative is that governments are going to fall down. Firstly, a minority might get too angry and might overcome them, right? I think that's incredibly problematic because the minorities only share their hate of the dictator. It means you have no form of state buy-in, that means you have no form of power sharing, it means you have no one to cooperate. You also have no one with a monopoly of violence who's going to prevent these groups from directly battling each other. That's where you resort into civil war, as you saw, for example, in Syria. I think that's incredibly problematic precisely under their metric. You get chaos. The second thing that could happen is that the government internally falls apart, right? For example, because the leader died and the succession didn't go well, or because the generals got into a fight. We saw this happening in the past many times. The same issue there, right? There's no one with an exact monopoly of violence. It means there's no one to restore order in any kind of meaningful way. It means simply that violence is the only thing that's going to happen. It means you resort in a civil war again. Either you get an extremely oppressive government, or you get a civil war. You probably get both. We don't think that's something the West should support. Then, on minorities. Firstly, minorities are inherently worse off than a democracy, right? You don't have the basic rights that we are providing you with. That's the first thing. Secondly, you have no sort of reason to hold the government accountable to be nice to them. It's even worse. Now the dictators are often a significant minority, given the fact that in many places in the Middle East, for example, Shia and Sunni, and therefore, in many cases, hate this minority, or at least the people there are reliant on hate them as well. That means oppression is going to happen to a significant extent. Two impacts of this. Firstly, you think it's wrong in and of itself to simply have these minorities in horrible occasions. It means thousands of people being tortured. It means many people being killed by a government that should be there to trust them. I think that's incredibly horrific and not something the West should support. It's far better on our side of the house where you have this kind of democracy. Lastly, in many cases, this minority eventually comes to power, right? Look, for example, at Shia and Sunni in Iraq. I think that's incredibly problematic at the West is complicit in the government that's incredibly horrible to them. That means they are going to hate us, the West, as well. It means you have no sort of leverage over this country. It also makes radicalization, extremism more likely because they now hate the West because it's directly complicit in oppression of them. I think that's incredibly harmful as well. Either they get a situation in which you get civil war or authoritarian regime. In both cases you get oppression, which is wrong in and of itself, but also leads to radicalization and less leverage. We couldn't be prouder to oppose.
Very much for your speech. DPM, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, the entire opposition bench in this debate cannot win simply by saying that authoritarian regime is bad. Because to some extent, we agree that democracy might be the best solution for governance system. But the question in this debate is this. Can then an authoritarian regime that is already established should be distorted by an exported types of democracy that is defined by the Western and imposed by the Western society? We think that is exactly what creates instability and that will worsen the condition that this authoritarian regime would have. So that side of the house cannot just point out that there is a flaw in authoritarian regime, but this side of the house needs to prove why exporting democracy is the solution to answer and stop authoritarian regime for getting worse. Now that would be my first point of contention, right? Can negative side of the house policy create stability through exporting democracy? We think that what Terry has explained to you was pretty clear, right? Because these countries that we export the democracy are countries that is still immature and still unable to form themselves, even becoming united. We're talking about countries like Afghanistan, we're talking about countries like Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, and I think that in that situation, when Western countries support the opposition, fund the opposition, that will worsen the immaturity of the society and will result into a bad condition. What we project and what would be better would be even if democracy is the solution. We think that the mature way, like what happened in Tunisia, when the entire society are the one that revolt and there is no government, there is no Western-backed support coming to that country, that resulted to a much better and a much more stable government system. But if cases like Tunisia will not happen in the future, we think it's so much better to not have any intervention to begin with, because that results into three harms that we've established in opening government. It leads elites into society of the country that we intervene believe that the government that is established, one, it is successful, become the puppet government of those countries that intervene. These cases happen in Afghanistan. These cases happen in Iraq. There is also a possibility that there are people that feel that they are excluded by the system, like what happened in Egypt and Iraq. Exclusion of group is inevitable because Terry has explained to you that the United States and people that come from Western owe something to the opposition group. They promised the opposition group to be able to ensure and live in the definition of democracy that the opposition wants to begin with. That is the case in Iraq, and Egypt, in which Indian of the day Sunni majority is being sidelined because that is not under the definition that is agreed when US support the opposition to begin with. We think that there is an inevitable harm that they need to deal with, Madam Chair, and they have not done that on the leader of opposition. But we think there are also time and cases when even the opposition group is not yet united, like what happened in Syria. In that regard, Madam Chair, we think that the ununited opposition is bad to begin with because when they are successful to topple down the government, the division of power, the people they are fighting for the power will be unable to consent to what terms of agreed definition of government that they want to have. But worsen off, when United States are the one that export the democracy, there must be some set of interest in which United States want to define what kind of democracy that they want, because that is how they become accountable to the society that agreed to send the intervention to begin with. That means United States will set a certain types of political group that is okay, what types of political group that is not okay, we think it's bad. Points. Sorry.
Would you support IS if it would be able to establish a stabilized caliphate?
Well, we think that IS is something that we have to fight for, because not because they does not agree with democracy, but simply because they kill people. But if in the end of the day, ISIS is an established government, ISIS believe that they can bring about stability and the society in that area agree ISIS should be the one that govern them, we think that is fine. But right now, ISIS is not an established government because there is an established government already in Iraq and Syria, and ISIS is not the one to go. And furthermore, we think that the reason why ISIS is there to begin with is because there are groups that feel sidelined when the United States intervened in Afghanistan and Iraq and resulted into government that exclude the Sunni to begin with, and that what caused ISIS, Madam Chair, they need to deal with that as well. So how do we best provide welfare? This is the extension that I'm going to talk about, because that side of the house needs to argue, cannot say that authoritarian regime is bad. We've seen so many authoritarian government becoming so pragmatic. Case in point, China, Saudi Arabia, where we think that they believe that stability is the solution for them to ensure economic gain and economic development will unfold. We think that this case in terms of Syria, we think that the escalation of attack to minority, even if we agree minority are being discriminated, but the escalation of attack to minority comes when United States support the minority to begin with. We think that our side is going to be much better, because then the government will treat the minority as someone that they need to handle nicely, because otherwise it will lessen the credibility of the authoritarian regime, and in the end of the day probably lessen the interest of investors to come, because they understand the situation is unstable to begin with. That side of the house cannot say that, well, authoritarian regime only provide basic needs. We agree, probably minority does not get as much as the majority at the current status quo, but we think that it's much better if we continue and further economic support and economic growth to unfold in this country, which can only happen if stability is in place at first. We think that is the case of China, that is the case of Singapore, where in the end of the day, even if they're a minority that was once oppressed, government understand that the needs of society to be included, the needs of minority to be included, is the way to ensure maximum growth of economy when everyone contribute to that system is going to take place. We think that freedom of expression in comparison to economy is less important, because people cannot eat by saying what they want in media, but people need money, and money can only come by opening government proposal. Worse, Madam Chair, we think that when they apply their proposal, it will only link democracy with with wreck and with instability and lawlessness. Because for so long, the export of democracy that US has been trying to do has resulted into unsuccessful trial. We think that it's bad if democracy continuously linked with instability and lawlessness. We think that our status quo is going to be much better to introduce democracy if we have to introduce democracy by creating a maturity society first. We propose.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now let's welcome PRO. Please prefer gender pronoun is she or they. Leah.
Opening government has to support stabilizing regimes that make people's lives a living hell, that restrict their freedom of religion, that restrict their ability to decide on their own identity, but even more so, also don't have any incentive to care about them economically, even if opening government tries to tell you that in their last speech. We tell you those regimes are oppressive. Those regimes mean it becomes impossible for oppositional parties to grow, have any chance of success. That's why we're proud to stand in opposition. Two things. Definitely one thing that I'm going to add in my speech. I'm going to talk about democracy, why it's likely, more importantly, why it's comparatively better. We didn't expect to have to spend that much time on it, but we are going to do that. Secondly, if I have time for it, I'm going to talk about Western buy-in into foreign policy, now actually explaining why it's far more likely for there to be money going into foreign policy from the West, why that's so great, why that means there's more capability to do interventions, but also finish them correctly instead of leaving before any actual work is done. All right, first, lots of rebuttal. Government tells you that on minorities, basically the idea that minorities can gain trust in a dictatorship. So first, and they tell you that sometimes that's preferable for minorities, right? First of all, note, we know in most cases that there is an opposition that wants an intervention or that wants some kind of help, right? We tell you that means that and in the status quo, they're fundamentally unable to do anything. My partner tells you why that's true. Even if you don't believe that dictatorships start out as oppressive as they sometimes do, they definitely get worse progressively, right? We tell you why that's true. We tell you that is because dictatorships get less and less of an incentive to cater to what their public wants, right? Because it's so easy for them to gain more strength in the monopoly of, for example, the distribution of how they distribute wealth and how they distribute violence, right? That means it gets progressively easier for dictatorships to suppress their people and listen to them less. But secondly, we tell you, minorities, empirically, are often hunted, prosecuted. Being in the opposition is often illegal, which means there is no gaining of trust like opening government tries to tell you, right? We also tells you that terrorism is therefore more likely, right? Radicalization of minorities that have absolutely no say in opening government side of this debate, whereas in opening opposition, they have some type of an opportunity to grow, right? We tell you that outweighs the anger that dictatorships feel when they fall. We tell you there's a constant fear inside government, a constant fear of being killed, a constant fear of not being able to belong to any other kind of regime than the dictatorship, right? So then they tell you, but dictatorship help minorities because they want a stable economy. So we tell you that they, in order to make this point, still need to prove why there is an incentive at all for dictatorships to cater to minorities that don't fall under their regime, right? We actually tell you they don't have that incentive. We tell you they have an incentive for wealth not to be divided equally. So that even means that if the economy is doing terribly, that doesn't necessarily impact the regime in any way, right? It means that dictators can just redistribute all the wealth towards themselves and towards the group that they belong to, which means there's no incentive to care for the minority. Let's see. Yeah, then they tell you about puppet governments, right? They tell you that Western puppet governments might happen. And their example is Iraq, right? First of all, we tell you, under their logic, and we buy that, people don't want puppet governments, which is why they will eventually, after democracy stabilize, won't elect Western governments, right? Which means eventually, as in Iraq, governments aren't Western anymore and actually represent the people. But also we tell you, it's partly also a thing of regulation, right? We think there's a lot of space for things like education, showing people what exactly their benefit would be from being in a democracy. We tell you that's definitely less of a trigger for like the people that don't have as much. We tell you, so this is basically comparatively, right? Under their side of the house, the dictator might be angry that they're not in power anymore, while all of the other groups that weren't at that point in time in power would be very happy under our side of the house. Before I move on to why we're so happy with democracies, sure.
If majority of society still believe in the past dictator, how can minorities who support democracy influence the majority to support them?
All right, so essentially, if they are actually a majority, then there'll probably also be a majority in the democracy, right? At least the essential difference is that the minority is in government instead of being suppressed and not being able to have any kind of political will, right? So in both sides of this debate, the majority will have some kind of power. We tell you at least we have some importantly accountable power for the minority. All right, so then on to democracies. So firstly, why do we think that they're likely? So basically two reasons. First of all, empirically, we tell you in lots of the places where the West has chosen not to stabilize but to instill democracies, there was an opposition that was in grave need of help, right? It was obviously the will of the people in those instances that there would be some kind of help, right? But secondly, logically as well, right? We think there are far more groups that don't have power in a dictatorship and are suppressed in a dictatorship, whereas they aren't in democracy. So then why comparatively is it better for there to be democracy? First of all, we tell you there's far more rights for minorities even if the dictatorship is stable, right? Those dictatorships are stable because they are being oppressive enough to minorities for them not to be able to access their rights, right? So we tell you those minorities definitely have an advantage in being in a democracy. Secondly, we tell you lots of dictatorships aren't stable and won't become stable in government side of the house. My partner tells you why that leads to civil war, why it leads to the formerly suppressed minority, once they're in power, to be angry, to want to have the same kind of oppressive regime as they have been living under, right? We tell you there's intrinsically less suppression in democracy where all power is shared. But lastly, we tell you, you stop the cycle of all of the above getting worse, where the dictatorship has a very easy time instilling more and more of their own power, making the access minorities have to rights even worse. So what are we left with as a comparative for this debate? In government, they defend making the regimes that are already strong, already so strong that they make minorities' lives, living hells, even stronger. They make it impossible for there to be any kind of durable democracy in the future, meaning those minorities will stay suppressed as they are. On opposition, however, we tell you that democracy is likely, that people that are suppressed, people that aren't part of the small elite that benefits from being in a dictatorship, want to be able to be in power. More importantly, we tell you how much more accountable these kinds of regimes are, which means they're far more likely to cater to the will of the people. For all these reasons, vote opening opposition.
Thank you very much for your speech. To open the closing half debate, let's welcome member for the government whose preferred gender pronoun is he or they. Here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What we need in this debate is a discussion, a balancing of the West's interests and the demands of the Middle East, especially in terms of securing long-term peace. We feel that the opening debate has a tendency, especially with the contributions of opening opposition, to lead into a generic debate on the harms and the benefits of a democracy. We reject that debate. What we think the debate should be is a discussion on what the West foreign policy should be if it wants to retain its status, and two, if it wants to actually solve the problem, for which we have two ideas to bring from closing government. Firstly, why it's key to maintaining legitimacy as the world's police, and second, why it's necessary pragmatically for long-term peace. But before I move on, a few responses. Basically, opening opposition's case is that democracy is the most relatable and benevolent. They list benefits like accountability and all of those things. And on the comparative, say authoritarian regimes are oppressive. Look, government is not defending torture. And it is a mistake for opening opposition to continue forcing on government to defend things like ISIS or oppressive regimes. The model was very clear, and it's in fact disrespectful to misrepresent it. They want to participate with them, negotiate concessions, and wield the power of intervention only when extremely necessary, which means contrary to what opening opposition thinks we want, we are not abandoning those states. But second, just saying that democracy is good has no value in this debate. I agree that given this debate setup, it's easy to think that democracy is one of the best things in the world. But that is a crucial mistake in this debate. We have to let go of our preconceived notions and just blindly agree that democracy is a good value. We're talking about the people who were raised in a completely different way, such that concepts like secularism or democracy are entirely foreign to them. And it isn't to say that democracy is the only good thing in the world. They can make do with totalitarian regimes like Saudi Arabia, not ISIS, or an actual caliph, much like the one in the 6th century, not what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is trying to do. What we want to make sure is that we want a government that works if they want it, ladies and gentlemen. So it's not enough for opposition to continue pushing the idea that democracy is good when their only comparative is oppressive regimes. But note, ladies and gentlemen, that this stance does not exclude the possibility of a democracy. We agree that democracy has its merits and democracy sometimes is necessary. But what we want in closing government is not to export it, not to enforce it, and wait for them to want it before actually assisting them on it after the responses. But then they continue to say, oh, we're making regimes stronger. No, what we're doing is we're making the conditions favorable for dissent and such that they're able to rally safer and they're able to bring them to the table. We think that going against the regime isn't necessarily a vote for democracy. It's just making sure that they are less oppressive and we actually have the government that we want. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
You said you want to export democracy only when the people want it. Do you think the people currently under the Assad regime don't want democracy?
Intervention doesn't mean exporting democracy. What exporting democracy means is they're going to enter the country, topple the government, and hold elections. What we mean by intervention is stop the killings, wait for a transitory period, and assist them in doing that. That's what we don't want. On the first reason why it's key to maintaining legitimacy as a world police, the foreign policy of the West, embodied by the likes of the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO states, is one of a world police, in that limiting threats outside limits threats inside. But there are many considerations in order for a foreign policy to be successful, the foremost of which we contend is domestic political support, the lack of which ousted the war in Vietnam and ousted the war in Iraq. And the problem with exporting democracy and why it's unlikely to garner the necessary support is that it's very arbitrary, in that what it measures as success is extremely vague. We don't know if the people are happy with the democracy, we don't know if they are. But more importantly, we think very often it fails, most especially in the countries where we're forcing the democracy or explicitly rejecting these kinds of democracy, which is what happened in Iraq. And as a consequence, we find it hard to gather the necessary support for the troops in Syria, because every time we bring up the idea, people remember the wounds of Iraq, people remember the failures in Afghanistan, and when people remember that the election we imposed on Iraq resulted in further bloodshed, we think it's harder for us to make sure that we're able to intervene in necessary cases, because whenever we export democracy and we fail, we remove the necessary domestic support for future interventions. Why do we think the comparative stability is better in terms of domestic political support? First of all, we think it is measurable. It is easier to see how it is successful, and that we are reducing the death rates, we are reducing the clashes, and it's more visible. It's easier to see a country without war than to see a country who's happy with democracy. And we think that's key for a foreign policy existing. If we want to make sure that the West actually has a foreign policy, we think that exporting democracy should be out of the toolbox, because that has done nothing for us in the past, but make sure that we have less support for whatever foreign policy we want to have in the future. But yeah, opening.
So our duty is not that we should intervene in every dictatorship. Our duty is that the situations where the West is participating in nation building anyway we're going to do democracy, and that be in other situations we are slowly moving towards a democracy because alternative is fundamentally unsustainable. Could you please engage with that?
Just because a feature of a democracy is participatory doesn't mean that it is always the solution. A compatible government for a state is not dependent on what the West thinks it's good for that country, but for what the people actually want for that country, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who's going to be participating with that country. And that's why stability, just maintaining stability, is key to long-term peace. We submit that stability is a precursor to long-term peace. At the point in which a country is unstable, say for example Syria, the likely feature is there are so many competing interests that will hinder our ability to hold free and fair elections. Because there are many competing interests that extend beyond who should be the leader. A question on how should we govern, a question on should we have a state religion, like for example a caliph. And the tendency of the discourse, if you hold it in an unstable region, is it tends to be one-sided because you want a democracy. Second, you're unable to represent all sides because some of them don't want democracy. And third, it excludes anyone remotely connected to the toppled regime, which is why Iraq fell down, because we were unable to contain the Sunni insurgency, the General Military Council of Iraq, and 1920 brigades who want something else. We think what stability does on the comparative is it tempers the discourse in such that we're able to sit down and talk and ask what we actually want. And that decision is better because you get a popular government that people actually want to participate in. You have compromises which leads to an understanding between them, and it entails less post-war reconstruction. It entails less cost on the part of government to make sure that we're able to maintain that kind of long-term peace. So we think that this is better for the long term for all interests. Only when we will see a government that people actually want will the West be successful in actually giving birth to a nation, which is why we're proud to propose.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now let's welcome member of the opposition whose preferred gender pronoun is he or they.
In response to a POI, opening governments say that they would not change anything about change ISIS, even if it is stable, because they are killing. The only burden from this side of the house then is to show why in the long term more people die because of conflict within the exact type of regimes you are supporting, while at the same time being the first thing that provides the comparative of why even imposed democracy provides long-term moderacy. Those are going to be the two planks of extension. Before that, 2 points rebuttal to the closing government. The first thing they say is this harms the ability to play the world's police for the USA. Here's the problem. When you say you are the USA and you're going to try to not impose democracy, you're less likely to receive the support of the American public because they buy into democracy and believe that is the very best system. Given they have positive influences of that system, they believe in that system because they get benefit from that. So therefore, if you're going to say we're going to prop up Gaddafi and going to prop up Assad, you're less likely to receive support because they see them as dictators and people who have oppressed minorities. The only other thing we then get are two things under the ability to play the world's police. First of all, statistics on deaths. I'm not sure why those are mutually exclusive, can also be on our side of the house. The last thing they say is why they're more likely to fail, or extension shows why those regimes you support are even more likely to fail in the long term. Now the second thing they talk about is discourse, and why it's extremely important. Note, under a dictatorship there's no need for discourse, because your discourse is not going to change the policy of the country. So there never need to talk out and speak out about those things, because you feel helpless in those instances. More importantly, dictators can shut down discourse when they simply do not like it. So the post-conflict reconstruction is often highly contentious, and when dictators do not buy into your side of the story, they're simply shutting it down under your instance. That's impossible under a democracy. First of all, why democracy, even imposed, moderates conflicts in the long term? Here I want to take them on their very best and explain why conflict is less likely on our side of the house. So, first of all, under a democracy, there is a need for discourse because you need to change the policy and how the country is governed. In that way, you're able to voice your grief in a platform and therefore gain attention by that. Your voice is now finally listened to and not shouted out by a dictator who control that very discourse. Importantly, the other side can now more and better understand what your grief is and why you fought in that conflict. So there's more likely to be reconciliation and accept your side of the house. Second of all, the other forms of violence become delegitimized because those forms of people generally do not like violence. They put their own own lives on for the stake. Importantly, when they have another mean of democracy, in which they can voice their griefs, which they can voice the concerns they have of the country, which they can voice the oppression which has happened in the past, they're more likely to use that platform because that is a more legitimate platform, and when they are is less likely to harm them instead of taking a gun and shooting the other side. Third of all, we would tell you is that the other side is less likely to oppress under a democracy. Two key reasons. First of all, because you need votes across the spectrum in order to gain a majority of that country. So therefore, you're more likely, especially in sectarian divided countries, to appeal to them by not oppressing them, gaining their support, and therefore put you in government. So therefore, in lots of those cases, it stops oppression on the that side of the house. But crucially, they wanted to stake their case on aid and why that was so important in de-radicalizing that country. Here's the key thing. People from the West are more likely to give aid to a democracy for the very simple reason that when they believe that it goes to a dictatorial regime, they are believed that that it is going to be used by the very dictator to prop up his own regime and do not help those individuals. The nuanced story about why it might trickle down to the people doesn't come out in public discourse. So when people more buy into that system, they're more likely to give development aid and the exact need on the other side of the house. They talked about investors and why they are so important for stability. My second point of extension explains exactly why stability is less likely on the other side of the house. Before that, yes.
Do the opposite and assume our success. If under a moderated discussion, they decide that they want an Islamic republic, will you still force a democracy?
We're already dealt with that POI. It's the same as opening government. So, conflict and what happens. So here we're going to take them at their very best. They made a case that conflict was worse than oppression. I'm going to now explain why conflict is more likely on the side of the house. The nature of post-conflict is often that it's sectarian, that it's divided not just on minority, but among equally big groups, which, for example, within Iraq. What we would tell you then is that when someone from an authoritarian regime is more likely to come from a specific group, such as Assad in Syria, what that other group then faces is severe oppression. So, because Assad doesn't need the power and doesn't need to cater to the very group to be in power. Furthermore, the people that support him and he needs to cater to have ingrained hate for the other side. First of all, because they have killed you in the past. There's often historical grief in these very instances for that's been committed. But second of all, because the other government, in order to start that war in the first place, has demonized them as scum in those instances. So therefore, there's extreme oppression of the other side under their side. They're going to then fight back, and given that they have a reasonable amount of people within that state, they can gain support and often topple that government, just as we, for example, have seen in Egypt. What is the problem then? You're then replaced by a much more radical version of that government, because the West has made their suppression possible by instating that dictator, by propping him up, by giving him aid, by giving him the weapons to shoot your family. Why is that worse under three comparatives? First of all, because when you hate the West, you're less likely to buy into Western concepts. Often, democracy is seen as a Western concept in these many instances. So when you associate democracy in the West with the very oppression of your family and your people, that's less likely to happen under their side of the house in those very instances. Second of all, you're less likely to accept help in terms of aid, which they wanted to talk about, because you do not believe in the good faith of that very aid, given that the past time they want to try to help you was actually kill your family in those very instances. So therefore, they're less likely to buy in and accept that aid. But more importantly, given that a conflict has happened and both sides has radicalized, they will fight back in those many instances. But now those who were previously oppressed have become the oppressor, and therefore the side which was previously in power again wants to fight back to get it. This is the faith of Iraq, where there's been switching of sides between Sunnis and Shias all the time, simply for the fact that those governments did not get the authoritarian rule of the American government. It would have been much better if we've imposed democracy. They were right. It is an unfair debate to simply say, well, authoritarian regimes are bad. But we were the first team in this debate to provide the actual comparative. We have a more legitimate, a more open, and a form of government which has the incentives to cater to all, rather than oppress the many. I could not be prouder to oppose.
To close the debate on the government side, let's welcome Government Whip Speaker, whose preferred gender pronoun is she or they.
Wow. Can this be bended? Too small. Perhaps the greatest mistake of the West has always been to define the needs of the people in all of these regimes based on what their conception of need is. What we told you coming from closing government is that the reason why stability has to be the priority is because when it comes to governance, we have to empower these local groups, we have to empower the locals to be able to find their own form of governance that best suits them. While we think that for Western liberal democracies are good, we think that in certain circumstances, people do acknowledge that authoritarian regimes are better for them. We may never understand the Arabians or the Chinese for their choices of their own governments, but nonetheless, these are things that have worked for them. In the eyes of the West, it may not be good, but we say that in terms of priority, we cannot always impose our will on these people because to begin with, we entered this intervention for their interest. We think it's time for them to define what is good for them. We think it's time for us to change our priorities in our policies. The first question I want to answer is, are dictatorships inherently evil? Because notice that if the ultimate endpoint of our foreign policy is to export democracy, then ultimately opposition had to prove in this debate that dictatorships are inherently evil and we can never stand for them. What they said was that opposition said that across the board that dictatorships are bad because basically they don't have accountability mechanisms, right? And which means that they're going to oppress minorities, etc., etc. Firstly, we don't think it's true. In fact, smart dictators know that fear is the worst control over people because fear inspires anger. The last thing dictators will want is a full-grown revolution which would force him to use limited military resources on the people. That's why notice that successful dictatorships, unlike Bashar al-Assad, actually use social mechanisms for control, giving people education, controlling their history, ladies and gentlemen, and in some cases, giving the people what they want. This is why we think that minorities will be heard to some extent. In fact, they will get the needs that they want, ladies and gentlemen, because minority radicalization is also something that dictatorships fear because they want to make sure that they stay in power. That's why we think that the likelihood of them to be too oppressive as opposition purports is unlikely. We will agree that there are certain rights you give up, right? The freedom of expression, religion. They sound very important, we will agree. But like in any governance, notice that some rights have to be given up to the government in order for them to fulfill their function. It's just a necessary consequence that in certain authoritarian regimes, the rights that you have to give up are expression and religion, in the same way that in democracies, sometimes you also have to give up your right to privacy in order for the state to fulfill its action. What does this mean? This means that ultimately there is some level of accountability because authoritarian regimes also have to maintain their sovereignty. This is also why we don't agree with the idea coming from closing opposition that we're going to create anti-Western sentiments due to oppression. Note that all of the examples that closing opposition gave are actually examples of failed democracy that caused the anti-Western sentiments, like Egypt, for instance, like enshrining the Muslim Brotherhood, or even enshrining the Shiite majorities within Iraq. We think that those things are not mutually exclusive because in times of instability, democracies actually fail the people, and that's when the people realize that this system of governance was imposed on us, and that's why our lives are like this. It's because the Western liberal democracies forced this on us. Comparatively, notice that minorities also don't get any real advantages in opposition side because we think that democracies are reliant on voting systems and the strength of politicians come in numbers, which means that dominant majorities, by virtue of their voting capability, are still able to alienate majorities by forcing their democratic governments to prioritize them. We've seen that happening in Iraq, we've seen that happening in Egypt. Even assuming that we need to topple these regimes, we think that it's not always violent as opposition purports it to be, like the People Power Revolution or even Gandhi's revolution. If it becomes violent, that's instability, ladies and gentlemen, which means that we intervene. What's the point? Given that authoritarian regimes can be good or bad, we think that Western liberal democracies should not make the value judgment, and we don't think that the destruction of authoritarian regimes is always a necessary endpoint to our foreign policy.
The second question then becomes, what is the West's interest in its foreign policy? Before I move on to that, I'll take a POI from opening.
We show that democracies can be achieved either through nation building or through soft power. Could you make a comparative of an inherently unsustainable dictatorship?
Here's the thing, we really don't need to make the comparative because your burden of proof was to say that democracies have to always be the end point of all of our interventions. We will agree that in certain circumstances it can work, but the thing is, it should not be included in our foreign policy as the necessary endpoint because of the discussion now I'm going to put into place. What is the West's interest in its foreign policy? We think that the current interest of the West is to maintain its presence as a hegemony, which means two things. Firstly, we would need the political capital in order to have the public support to support all of our interventions, which means that we need to have measurable outcomes to show that our interventions are worthy. This is where we think that CEO's response was quite problematic because they assume that American people and Western liberal democracies always want democracy. Notice that in the entire world, there has been a consensus that there are certain circumstances where local groups should be entitled to choosing their own form of governance even outside the democracy. That's why we regretted our intervention in Iraq because we worsened the situation by assuming that Saddam Hussein was an ultimate evil. We think that ultimately, stability has to be the goal because when we show the people that we're able to make sure that the humanitarian needs or to make sure that the needs of the people are given to them, then that's when we're able to show our people that the interventions were worth it, that our interventions were able to produce a good for the people on the ground level. But the second thing we brought to you, coming from closing government, that they never responded to, was the idea that for long-term peace, stability is the precursor to that democracy that they wanted. So in the future, it's possible for these particular groups to adopt democracy, but we don't think that it's something that the US should impose at this point in time. Notice that we told you coming from closing government that what matters is that the form of governance achieves its purpose, which is to ultimately allow the people to access their needs, which is ultimately to allow the people to be able to access their basic rights. These things, as we've showed to you coming from closing government, can exist in any form of governments that the local groups choose for themselves. And that's why we think that that given the West's interest in its foreign policy, we don't think that exporting democracy is the ultimate end goal, but we think the only thing we're accountable for is stability. With that, we propose. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your speech. To close the opposition debate and the entire debate, let's welcome opposition with whose prevention for
What we bring you in this debate is that we say when the West prolongs oppression, it's more likely to lead to worse forms of conflict, which means more instability on the long term, which means more radicalized groups like IS who fight for their freedom and now also fight against the West because they think the West is oppressing them directly. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to quickly talk about what the West should look like. We don't think that's particularly important in this debate. Then I'm going to talk about developing nations, how these nations will actually improve for the citizens. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the chance of democracy versus conflict. On which side of the house will more horrible things for these civilians happen? So firstly, this idea of, well, the West wants to be the police of the world and should behave towards that. Three responses. First of all, well, the West should not want to be the police of the world, right? We think that's not something that the West should want. They should not try to police the world. Secondly, we say that it's very hypocrite of the West to say it's democracy, something that happens for their civilians and their citizens are mature enough, as opening government wants to use the words. We think that that's very hypocritical and we think that's very wrong. But thirdly, we simply do not care, right? We think that it's far more important that these civilians are safe and these citizens will get better lives. So then lastly, this idea about the West, when they say the West should not force other countries to live up to their standards or take their standards. That's quite problematic if you take away the authority and the autonomy of individual citizens to express their opinion and you're propping up a regime that is beneficial towards you, right? Closing government want to talk about how the West tries to perpetuate their own ideas and tries to increase their own benefits. We think that means it's very likely that they're going to prop up regimes that, for example, are not Muslim. We think that's bad, right? We think one of the reasons Iran radicalized horribly is because the West tried to tried to prop up a regime that was simply did not fit that culture and was not something that Iran wanted, right? If a closing government really wants popular support for a government, we think the most easy way to get that is populist voting for that government, right? We think that's relatively clear. So moving on to the idea of developing nations and how they might improve. From opening government, we get the idea of economic development. Two responses. First of all, we say that for dictators, to a certain extent, there's an incentive not to get their population too educated, too well off, because that means they might start to think about other things, like, for example, the right to speak your mind. But secondly, we think the narrative that government uses is also not very beneficial for economic investment. When they say this is not a country that's mature enough to deal with democracy, these are not citizens that are mature enough to deal with democracy, we don't think that means companies think that's a country they want to invest in, right? We think that's very problematic. So, moving on to the main clash in this debate, right? What we say is there's a bigger chance of democracy on our side of the house. There's less chance of more long-term conflict, which is going to be even more horrible. So OO gives a really extensive analysis on why democracy is good. Even if CG claims that democracy is not inherently good, we think OO does a pretty good job of explaining it. Even if you don't buy it, OG just basically says, we agree democracy is the best way to rule the world, right? So we think that that's not really a clash in this debate. So what do we bring to you under in our extension? What we explain is that because the West now helps to oppress you as an individual, you're more likely to hate the West. That means it's more likely that you will radicalize, which means it's more likely that you will not think Western values like freedom are values that you want. We think that moreover, on a very basic level, if the West doesn't fund, for example, opposition in Syria, it's more likely that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, people who don't want democracy, are going to fund horrible groups like IS, right? We think it's very important for the West to fund and to help these oh my god, to help these very help these more moderate groups and to help them strengthen themselves, right? We think that's very important because we think otherwise it's far more likely that even more radical groups are going to take power. We think that's very bad. So then we get the idea from closing government, well, dictatorships don't really want to radicalize their populations. First of all, we think that dictatorships to a certain extent necessarily have to oppress certain people, right? We think if dictatorships would have the popular support, would have people who would actually vote for them, they wouldn't have to be dictators, right? So we think that there are minorities that are not getting the rights. Secondly, we think there's very powerful strengthening rhetoric. If you say there's a certain group within society that is very harmful, that means we actually think dictatorships have a huge incentive to hate on certain minorities. I'll take opening.
Authoritarian government wants also an economic development either for themselves or for the country, and that can only happen by having a stable environment for investors to come and to give the money to begin with.
Okay, so two responses. First of all, I'm unsure why authoritarian regimes have such a huge benefit if there's economic development. I don't know if you've ever seen Kim Jong-un. He doesn't look like he's as hungry as his population because he can eat whatever he wants even though his population is starving, right? We think that's a very weird claim to make from opening government. So we simply think that's not true. I've dealt with this enough. So where was I? Okay, so what we say is that these minorities are far more likely to radicalize in a system where they're not explicitly asked to give their opinion, right? We agree, sometimes in democracies, it's really not that fun to be a minority, not to have the power to influence your state, however. We think that you still can go voting, which means you're more likely to feel like you influence that state, which is really important because that means it's less likely to radicalize. We think also you're less likely to see that so we think that in general these groups are less likely to radicalize. So note that it's really important what Flores brings to you in this debate because one, he talks about the long term, which is in general very nice, but secondly he talks to you about the development of the states on the long term, right? Because what opening government tells you is that they really like democracy. They think democracy is something that might be good. What we tell you is that's even more difficult to get democracy if you prop up a state, which means it's more difficult to topple over, right? It's even more difficult to get democracy if a lot of the groups that are powerful within society do not support democracy and do not like democracy because they think it's a West, do not like freedom because they don't like the West because they think the West is oppressing them. We tell you that it's less likely under our side of the house that we get horrible radicalized groups like IS that fight their population. That's why I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you, everyone. Please cross the floor and shake hands with each other.
Well done.
Great job.
Well done.
Great speech. Well done.
Well done.
Good speech, man.
Well done.
Well speech. Well done.
Thank you.
Oh, so good. So good.
Thank you.
Dit was opnieuw zo'n gevalletje stil, de extensie. Hier, stil, de extensie daar.
Dari Jakarta.